Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Saving lives has long been a convenient pretext for fighting wars and is invoked yet again as the United States considers a punitive strike against Syria. And while US politicians seem to be taken over by the "yes, we can" mantra, the rest of the world is more on the side of do no harm. Which of the two is in service of human rights? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Mr. Roth, I really appreciate you being here. If our viewers go to Human Rights Watch website now and check some of the news releases that were issued over the last few weeks, they can find all the usual suspects: Russia, China, Zimbabwe, Libya, even Israel. But what they wouldn't be able to find is any criticism of the proposed US strikes against Syria. Does it mean that Human Rights Watch is in favor of this proposed attack?
Well, we've actually put out two statements on this subject. And so, I do refer people to our website, hrw.org. We are explicitly not taking a position for or against particular airstrikes. Our main focus, as you can find in the statements that we've issued, is that our concern is with protecting civilian lives. And obviously, the issue on the table at the moment are the approximately 1,400 civilians who died as a result of the chemical weapons attacks in the Damascus suburbs. But obviously we're concerned about the tens of thousands, if not 100,000 civilians who have died during the conflict, mostly at the hands of conventional weapons. And our concern is that while there is heightened attention to this problem of Syria now, we hope that the answer is going to address the plight of civilians across the board, the many who have died already, the many more who might still die, the 2 million refugees. There's a lot to be concerned about.
Absolutely. You just mentioned that you try not to take sides. And the latest statement that I saw you issuing on the Syrian issue was in late August, when your organization put out a statement in which you said that not gassing children in their sleep is a basic humanitarian norm. And obviously everybody would agree with you on that. But the major disagreement in the world is who actually was gassing children in their sleep. And it seems to me that despite positioning itself as an international organization standing up for universal human rights, Human Rights Watch seemed to be taking the position of the American government in assuming that it was the Assad regime who actually perpetrated that chemical weapon attack. I wonder, why is that? If you are indeed an international organization, why not wait for the United Nations, which is the main international body, to conclude its investigation and then decide on what the course of action should be?
Well, I should say that, Human Rights Watch does not represent any government. We represent the truth. I would love it if the UN inspectors were going to tell us who they think was the author of this horrible chemical weapon attack. But unfortunately, that's not their mandate. They're going to come back and tell us the obvious, which was that a chemical weapon was used. We all know that. We've seen the videos. We've seen the pictures. Their mandate is not to tell us who initiated it. Now, Human Rights Watch has done our own investigation, looking at the facts, looking at the delivery mechanisms, looking at who had those delivery mechanisms. We've also reviewed the evidence put forth by a number of governments. We've looked at, the summary denials put out by Russia or Syria, which, frankly, are fairly unconvincing. I have to say that everybody who's looked at this, the bulk of the evidence points to Syrian government forces. And Human Rights Watch will be putting out our own report on this shortly. But this is based on our facts, on our own investigation. This is not based on, what the U.S. government might happen to be, what its position might happen to be.
With all due respect, your position seems to be pretty similar to the position of the U.S. government at this point. And I wonder if in your assessment of the situation on the ground, in your analysis of the evidence that you just mentioned, whether you had any access to the intelligence reports that are often cited by the American officials.
Yeah, well, first of all, again, you shouldn't assume that we adopt the U.S. government position simply because the U.S. government and Human Rights Watch may have come out to the same position on a particular case.
But
we are very often
it's a surprising coincidence,
with the U.S.
isn't
government.
it?
So, to say that you can't, well, let me finish, please. To say that, Human Rights Watch is somehow taking the U.S. government position because we may agree on the interpretation of the facts, that's really sort of taking a political view of it when we're trying to take a factual view of it. We're trying to say, what does the evidence demonstrate? And frankly, and this is not looking at the intelligence reports, this is looking at the material we've been able to collect, dealing with people on the ground, analyzing it through our own arms experts, looking at, what the capabilities of the Syrian government were, who would have, for example, the 50 liters of apparently sarin, but some kind of chemical agent, who would even have that quantity? And nobody's alleged that the rebels have that quantity. Who would be able to
Well, there are plenty of reports alleging that the Saudi Arabia may have provided the rebels with sarin gas and other poisonous gases. And those allegations were made not just by Russia or Syria, whose reports you called unconvincing, but also a number of European countries, traditional U.S. allies, are quite skeptical of the claims that this attack was perpetrated by the Assad regime, and even more skeptical of the proposed course of action.
Yeah, well, I have to say that we can get to the proposed course of action in a moment. We should focus on the facts first. But nobody believes this idea that somehow the Syrian government would let the rebels shoot off 11 different projectiles from government-controlled areas into only rebel-controlled or contested areas. This is some kind of hidden conspiracy that just doesn't meet the plausibility test.
But why is it a conspiracy?
And
it's a war zone, and many scenarios are possible.
I've got a bridge in New York I'd be happy to sell to you. Anybody can dream up wild concoctions, but you got to look at the facts. The only party to the conflict known to have sarin or chemical weapons in this quantity is the Syrian government. The only government that controlled the territory from which the attacks were launched was the Syrian government. The attacks were launched only against areas where the rebels either held the territory or they were contested areas that the government wanted to be able to retake. Everything, including the projectiles used, points in the direction of the Syrian government. Now, we can just close our eyes and say, oh, we can imagine in some alternative universe that it might have been somebody else. But let's get realistic. Nobody believes that.
Well, Mr. Roth, let's get realistic. If indeed the evidence is so convincing as you seem to allege and the American officials seem to allege, why those evidence are not presented to the UN Security Council? You just pointed out that, the investigation may not reveal who actually conducted that attack. So if you have such persuasive set of evidence and proof, then submit it to the United Nations, submit it to the Security Council, let the world decide this issue rather than tacitly endorsing, which I think is what you are doing, the proposed unilateral strikes by the United States.
Well, again, as I say, I'd be happy to talk about the military strike question in a moment. But your question, why do we not present evidence to the UN Security Council on the Syria question?
Absolutely.
You can't be serious. You're Russia today. Everybody, when they think about Russia in the Security Council, they think about Nyet. It's Mr.
But Russia did have its evidence, and it presented it to the UN Security Council. Why not to do the same?
Let me finish. Are you going to condemn Assad's atrocities? Nyet. Are you going to condemn, the clear, widespread bombing and targeting of civilians in rebel-held areas? Nyet. Are you going to send perpetrators on both sides to the International Criminal Court? Nyet. Of course, nobody trusts the Security Council at this stage because of the Russian veto. But I wish it were otherwise. I wish Russia were sitting there as a fair arbiter, but they're sitting there as the Nyet nation. Nothing is going to be enough to satisfy them to give up on their murderous ally, Assad.
Mr. Roth, but with, again, all due respect, if it was only Russia who would be opposing the proposed intervention, that would be a fair statement. But I think you would agree with me that there is a lot of discussion on that issue and a lot of disagreement on that issue. Again, not only among the Security Council members, but also around the world. Many Western countries, the flag bearers of democracy and human rights in Europe, in Asia, around the world, contesting those issues. Let's not act like the world supports the United States. The United States is prepared to go alone because nobody has an appetite for this type of intervention. And not many countries are convinced by the evidence that you are alluding to.
No. If there is clearly considerable dispute about whether there should be a unilateral military response, there is no serious dispute about the Assad government being responsible for the chemical attack. Now let's move on, because we don't want to confuse the two. Let's move on to the separate question. Given that it's very likely that all the evidence points in the direction of the Syrian government as having been responsible for this attack, then the question comes up, what should you do about it? Now, in an ideal world, I would say send Assad to the International Criminal Court. That way we don't have to bomb anybody. We can just try him in a fair tribunal.
You just said we don't have to bomb anybody. So you align yourself with the American government. That's an interesting phrasing here.
No, I don't align myself with the American government.
But you just said it.
In terms of what should be done, I mean, given that Russia is blocking the path to the International Criminal Court, then the question is, what else can be done? And there basically are two options on the table. One is to do nothing. To say, Assad, you may have just killed 1,400 civilians, but, tap you on the wrist. Please don't do that again. And we all know where that's going to lead. It'll lead the same direction that we've already seen with Assad, using cluster bombs against civilians, bombing civilian bread lines, using incendiary bombs on schools, bombing medical facilities, causing some 2 million refugees to flee. So, we know where that route goes. And this idea of, just trusting Assad, we've verbally reprimanded him, he won't do this again. So then the question is, how can you punish him? How can you deter him so that we don't get a repetition of this horrible atrocity? What's your answer to that?
Well, Mr. Roth, I don't know what's the answer to that, but I also think that there is an alternative.
But I'm asking you, what are you proposing? What are you proposing? There are two options. Well, there are three options on the table. One is the International Criminal Court with Russia blocks. One is a little tap on the wrist, which won't do anything. What are you proposing?
One other option would be the Geneva Conference that the United States is consistently sabotaging. But let me go back to some of the options that you just laid out. You said that doing nothing is the worst thing possible. And obviously, we have some examples in history when the United States used the same type of rhetoric with Human Rights Watch support and decided to do something in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Mali. As a result of that, did the human rights situation in all those countries, did it improve?
I understand that you're dependent on your... No, let me just finish. I understand you're dependent on your briefers. But you should please ask your briefers to do a better job.
Human Rights Watch
never supported... Human Rights Watch never supported the invasion of Iraq. We never supported the invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, if you look at the 2004 Human Rights Watch World Report, the entire lead essay was devoted to why Bush's intervention in Iraq was not a humanitarian intervention. So I don't know where you get these ideas that Human Rights Watch supports U.S. policy on this.
If you were so critical, and indeed Human Rights Watch was very critical of the Iraqi intervention and the fallout from that intervention, I don't understand why do you think this time around you should support another intervention in yet another Arab country?
As I said, Human Rights Watch has not taken a position for or against the idea of military retaliation for Assad's use of chemical weapons, but we are very conscious of the fact that if nothing is done, if Assad gets away with this with impunity, we have every reason to expect that he will expand the use of chemical weapons.
Well, that's precisely the rhetoric we heard from the United States on the eve of the Iraqi intervention. But, Mr. Roth, unfortunately, we have to take a short break now. But when we come back, the ultimate dilemma, is it worth risking human lives for the sake of human rights? That's coming up now on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the painful choice between human rights and human lives with Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth. Mr. Roth, just before we went to break, you were very critical of Russia and the deadlock in the Security Council. And indeed, in many of your statements on Syria, Human Rights Watch often takes specific issue with Russia and China and their, as you call it, intransigence on Syria. But correct me if I'm wrong, I was searching your archive and I was never able to find any statement that was critical of Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Turkey or indeed the United States specifically for their involvement in the Syrian conflict, because we may take different political sides here, it's clear, but when it comes to war and what fuels war and what ultimately leads to such an enormous death toll that you were talking about, clearly it's not one-dimensional. There are at least two sides to this war, and one can assume that this war wouldn't have gone into its third year and the death toll wouldn't have been so high if the weapons weren't flowing in.
Yeah, no, we've been critical really of all sides. And, I'm glad you raised that, because particularly on the point of the weapons flows, that is something that we are, critical of the Saudis and critical of the Qataris for providing weapons, particularly to al-Nusra, the highly abusive extremist part of the rebel movement. We've been very critical of Russia for continuing to supply arms to Assad despite the tens of thousands of civilians he has killed. We've been critical of the United States for continuing to purchase helicopters from Boron Export, the principal Russian exporter, even at the same time as it's supplying the killing machine of Assad. We've been critical of Britain and France for allowing Boron Export to advertise its wares at trade fairs outside Paris and London while it's supplying the killing machine of Assad. So yes, there's blame to go all around. I'd like to, if I could I come back to your opening statement, though? You say we're talking about human rights versus human life. That was a really odd formulation. I mean, let me just play that out a little bit. I guess what you're saying is that, in the name of human rights, might a military strike be authorized, and therefore human life would be at stake?
We have seen that in the past many times.
Applying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, but let's play that out here, because first of all, even if you take what the U.S. is proposing, what they would be doing is to, either strike empty buildings like the Defense Ministry, which would probably be worthless, or something that would be more significant would be, bombing the planes and the helicopters on air bases.
Mr. Roth, I don't know if you have been to Damascus. I've been to Damascus just last year, and let me just tell you that the Ministry of Defense is located in a very heavily populated area. There are a lot of civilians around that area where the ministry is located. So your assumption that it would be empty is a bit of a stretch.
Look, first of all, I'm not advocating targeting the Defense Ministry, which is pointless. You may remember when the U.S. targeted the Belgrade Defense Ministry, and they utterly destroyed it without any civilian casualties nearby. But my point is that doing nothing means many civilians get killed. It means that Assad basically continues to use chemical weapons with impunity, and we're going to see not just 1,400 killed, but 14,000 or 140,000. So where does this stop? So doing nothing does put human lives at stake. The kind of limited military strike that is being proposed, yes, there may be some civilians whose lives are in jeopardy. Human Rights Watch should certainly monitor very closely to see that everything is done as possible to spare civilians. But what this is really about is, do you do nothing and see, a second 100 and a third 100,000 civilians killed?
Okay, Mr.
Or do you
Roth,
try to stop Assad's killing machines despite Russia's support for it?
Okay, Mr. Roth, just 2 years ago, the international community tried to stop yet another killing machine. That machine was operated by Muammar Gaddafi. And I know that Human Rights Watch and you personally were rather complimentary of that intervention. You thought that was a success. And I know that many of your reports have been quite critical of the Libyan human rights record, but I think the extent of human rights violations in Libya were a bit understated, because under Gaddafi, sure, he was a dictator and people were thrown into jail, but this time, this time around there, people are thrown into jail in their thousands. They have absolutely no recourse to justice. People are being killed on the streets for simply, expressing their very light political opinions. So I wonder if you still think 2 years down the line, if you think the Libyan intervention was a success, because back then you had one dictator and you could apply pressure to him. But this time around you have thousands of little dictators and you have absolutely no leverage with them. Neither Human Rights Watch as an organization nor the international community as a collective force.
Well, what you're describing, first of all, under Gaddafi, and I was in Libya under Gaddafi, it was a terrible regime. And while you didn't get the large-scale killing of civilians until right at the end when the intervention took place, that's what it was designed to stop. You did have,
it didn't stop there,
countless numbers in prison. You had No, but in other words, first of all, Gaddafi, periodically would commit large-scale prison massacres. I mean, there would be summary executions. It was a terrible regime.
Well, there are still summary executions and mass killing going on in Libya these days.
You're interrupting again. You're interrupting again.
But I'm contesting your point.
What prompted the intervention? Yeah, what prompted the intervention was when Gaddafi was about to take Benghazi with every prospect of a massive bloodbath, and that's when NATO intervened. Now, what has come out of that? There's obviously the biggest problem today is there's a plethora of militia which the government doesn't control. And that's its principal task right now, is to build a monopoly of security forces so that you can't have each little militia deciding the law. One particular militia is holding Gaddafi's son. Another militia is running this or that town. Obviously, you can't build the rule of law with that system, and that's the challenge that's ahead of us in Libya.
Well, Mr. Roth, I think the assumption here, especially in the West, is that dictatorship is the worst thing ever. And there could be nothing worse than dictatorship.
No,
and
I don't think so.
I can understand that. But
no, I
again,
don't think that's...
But if we take the issue of Libya, you just said that the main task is to build security and improve government institutions, strengthen civil society. But seriously, you can't do any of that in Libya these days. And again, back in Gaddafi's times, he had some incentives to at least go along with something that the West and human rights community were demanding. The militia on the ground in Libya these days have absolutely no incentive to do that. And I wonder what would stop the situation developing and taking the same scenario in Syria if those strikes that the United States is proposing are carried out, and if Assad is indeed eliminated as the head of a state, if his governing structures are eliminated, do you think that would ultimately improve the human rights situation on the ground?
Well, 2 points. I mean, first of all, I don't think dictatorship is the worst possible scenario. It's a bad one. But the worst situation is something like what you have in Syria today, where you have a series of militia. Nobody controls the country. You have different parts of the country controlled by different factions. One of those factions happens to be the government. But you have, mass killing going on. So this is not just a dictatorship. Nobody was proposing military intervention when it was just Assad ruling over a unified country.
The United States was proposing intervention to get rid of Assad. Well, what are you talking about? That was the policy statement by President Obama to get Syria rid of President Assad.
No, let's go back to 3 years ago, before the war broke out. Nobody was talking about overthrowing Assad. He was a ruthless dictator, but he wasn't killing 5,000 civilians a month. And so, nobody was talking about intervening. What is prompting the intervention is not the dictatorship, it's the killing of civilians, supported by Russia. So that's what this is about. Obviously, you have Russian allies that are dictatorships like Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. These are ruthless countries, but nobody's talking about military intervention there. What's prompting the talk about military intervention is the slaughter of civilians.
Well, I'm sure you're aware of the UN death toll figures, which are now over 100,000 people killed in Syria. What is much less publicized is that 80% of the death toll are actually males. They are not females, they are not children, they are males. And there was also a report not so long ago, a couple of months ago, by the United Nations that supposed that at least half of those victims were from the government side. So when you're talking about the killing of civilians, I think you're slightly misrepresenting the figures, at least as they're put out by the United Nations, because civilians, women, children, they are fleeing the country. But most of the people who are being killed in Syria these days are males. And I wonder why that is, because, statistically, that would be highly unlikely.
Well, first of all, your principal point, which is that, trying to pretend that the killings on both sides and everybody's equally guilty, that is just not true. The vast majority of the killing of civilians has been by the government in rebel-held areas.
So you're contesting the UN figures. You're contesting the UN figures here.
Let me finish, please. You're interrupting me.
You're contesting the UN figures.
Let's just look on the reality. Human Rights Watch has had people on the ground. No, you're not calling the UN figure. You're misrepresenting the UN figures. The vast majority of the civilians killed have been in rebel-held area, killed by government attacks, whether by aircraft or helicopters or artillery or rockets, things that the rebels don't even have. Now, yes, fortunately, many women and children are fleeing. Not every male in Syria is a fighter. many males are civilians and they're getting killed as well because, they're the ones who are standing on the bread lines when Assad attacks the bread lines. They're the ones who are working in the fields when cluster bombs are dropped. So, let's not misrepresent the figures. Human Rights Watch has been critical of the rebels. You can look at the front page of Thursday's New York Times and see that indeed, the rebels commit atrocities. I'm not covering up that at all. But let's not pretend that the two are equal. The party to this conflict that has been responsible for the mass slaughter of civilians, with the chemical weapons attacks being just the latest example, is Assad, the Syrian government.
Well, Mr. Roth, you're obviously entitled to your opinion. One reason why the death toll...
This is not opinion. This is fact. You're just making things up.
Well, you say so, but the international community disagrees with you. The United Nations disagrees with you. Well, again, I think we were presented with such facts in the past on the issue of Iraq, on the issue of Libya, on the issue of Mali, and look how it turned out to be. Maybe in the United States, in Washington, people have some sort of collective amnesia, but the rest of the world has a bit longer memory. But since we have just a few minutes left, let me come back to the issue of the war.
By the way, let's not, this is... Yeah, let me just finish here. I mean, this is just illogic to say, oh, the U.S. was wrong on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which it was. Therefore, we can make anything up we want about civilian casualties in Syria. That's completely illogic.
But Mr. Roth, I'm not arguing for doing nothing in Syria. I'm arguing for the United Nations taking the initiative, the United Nations, the international community, upholding the existing structure, that the international law that exists. But while what you seem to be arguing is that the United States is above that law. The United States has to do something when the rest of the world disagrees.
I would love it if we could go to the UN Security Council and it would enforce the law, the very established law, against the use of chemical weapons. But what happens when anybody goes to the UN Security Council to try to discuss the killing of Syrian civilians? You run into the Russian yet. You have an imperfect legal system here. You've got a system that's built up where the permanent 5 members of the Security Council can veto to protect their friends. That's what Russia is doing right now with Assad. And as a result, you've got nobody who's enforcing the law through the UN. The UN is stymied because of the Russian veto. And
well,
so the
Mr.
choice
Roth,
is,
it's not
do you do
just
Russia. The
United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon a couple of days ago came out with a statement calling on the United States to wait until the report by the UN inspectors. The United States is not interested in listening to or waiting for that report to come out. And unfortunately, Human Rights Watch, an international organization that positions itself as international organization, doesn't want to hear to the international community, which again is very divided on that issue. But unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do appreciate your being here. And to our viewers, please join us again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.